The influence of media is getting bigger every day and their impact is always deeper on people. So our idea is to measure and discuss about how media influence politics and how people view politics. So first of all, we are going to discuss on how media can influence a campaign and the vote of people. Then we will see how media can influence the government and the contrary too. The media as a political spotlight. While many are afraid that the biased media will shape people's views during elections, the media is more effective in dictating what issues voters should view as important and less effective in shaping those views. Also, the media might occasionally influence attitude. They are more frequently effective as a spotlight. The media is effective in telling voters what issues to focus on, and less effective in telling them what to think of those issues. Since the media is practically the only way to get campaign information widely distributed, they influence what issues people should consider when evaluating a candidate and on what criteria to judge them.
Opinion. Well, let's look at how the news media covers public opinion. When the media report on polls, what they're actually doing is telling a story about what public opinion is rather than just reflecting it. They're constructing how we understand public opinion. And the news media have a lot of power here because they choose what questions to ask and what questions not to ask. Ordinary people's opinions usually only count in as much as they respond to that conversation. Media influence on public opinion has been studied for many years now. We know, for example, that the media often play what's called an agenda-setting role. Public concern about issues tends to follow media coverage of those issues rather than any changes in the real world. A few years ago, the degradation of the environment, issues like global warming, destruction of wilderness and chronic air, water and soil pollution, started to get a fair amount of media coverage. Accordingly, polls suggested this was one of the most important issues for most people. But then the news media started to lose interest. And even though most of the environmental problems have actually become worse since then, polls showed public concern decreasing. Or take an issue like drugs. Over the last 2 decades, public concern about drugs has gone from 3% to over 50% and back to 3% in polls. And those shifts have absolutely nothing to do with the scale of the problem and everything to do with the volume of media coverage. The power of the media to define what issues are seen as important has to do with the relationship between what the media report and what they don't. Media influence in this sense is subtle but profound. The media can help shape or modify what we know about an issue.
The media acting as a spotlight in elections. By spotlighting what issues the public should focus on, the media helps to dictate what issues voters should be concerned with in election and what criteria they should use to judge politicians by. Most of the new information voters receive over the course of a political campaign is transmitted either by news media or through social networks such as interpersonal discussion. The media can greatly influence the public by limiting coverage of certain candidates. The media has the discretion to cover only the candidates and have a viable chance of winning the election. This is why the media act as a filter, by narrowing down candidates and shifting out lesser known candidates and giving more coverage to the better known. Hopefully in France, the CSA is giving the same amount of speaking time to each candidate. Also, the public should ultimately decide on its own who they feel is as a viable candidate. Moreover, media coverage practically ignores political parties and focuses instead on the candidates themselves. These observations have both positive and negative implications. This tends to be a more unbiased approach because it allows voters to become more informed about an individual candidate they are voting for, versus blindly voting for a candidate of a particular party. This could potentially cultivate a more diverse electorate. It could, however, be negative if voters focus too much on the candidates themselves and not on the issues the candidates stand for. This could have a negative effect if voters are not voting on candidates that best represent their views on public policy. Voters are less likely today to vote simply along party lines and more likely to split their tickets and defect from their party's choice if the candidate stand on the issues or the candidate's ideology is unrelatively unattractive. The media cannot directly dictate how voters will think, but it can influence what they should be thinking about. The media's influence on campaigning. The media can greatly affect elections by generating attention, whether it is through negative campaigning or through their choice in coverage of a candidate. In competing for the intention of the large swaths of the electorate that is uninterested, diseartered, or cynical, or is at least perceived by way politicians, interest groups, and even the media often resort to negatively demonstrations, polarization, and at times sensationalism. First spot commercial ever used in presidential campaign was in 1952 by Eisenhower, whose ads featured him answering a series of questions. Since campaign advertising has drastically changed, while candidates had to admit it, negative campaigning or comparative advertising have become the ad of choice because they have proven to have the most influence and be the most memorable. Also, lately, voters have become turned off from all the negative campaigning and name-calling campaign consultants know that voters are still cynical of politicians and will react to any sign of doubt. The media also influence the public's perception on the viability of a candidate. If reports say a certain candidate is ahead in an election, the public will come to accept that evaluation. What can greatly influence how voters cast their ballots. For the most part, people do not want to waste time on candidates they believe do not have a chance to win. Media's influence on governments. Even after the election, the media still plays a large role in influencing governments' agenda through spotlight issues and directing public and political concerns. While the media may not be a source of new ideas for the White House, it still has an effect on policymakers because the public's familiarity with political matter is closely related to the amount and duration of attention this affair will receive in the mass media. Government effect on the media. Just as the media can help to shape the political agenda, the government can equally influence the media's coverage. The government can dictate political media coverage to a certain extent, because the media regularly uses officials and sources in news stories and they are able to express their views and set their agenda on a regular basis. The media has become dependent on using officials because of the nature of news gathering routines and the need of regular, easy access to legitimate sources who possess valuable information. The government can shape the media's agenda by providing the press with briefings, background, press releases, interviews, and press conferences. Another example is that in France, the president can name the head of the public French television. So in one way, the president has an influence on what can be said or not and can give some orientation to the media. Conclusion. Through free media and pay media, the press is able to influence voters by telling them what issues are important at the time, while there is a widespread belief that the media is biased to either the right or the left. It should be less of a concern to the public because the media is largely unsuccessful in shaping opinions. The media also influence the government through the spotlight effects and discussing issues that might not have been on the top of the political agenda. The media has a very strong effect in politics, campaigns, and elections by dictating what issues are relevant, what candidates will get the most coverage, and what criteria they should use to evaluate candidates. Equally, the media is affected by the government, who is able to use the media as a political instrument by furthering the political views of whatever power is currently in office. while it is not absolute because outside factors also shape position. The media, public, and government has a cyclical relationship that influence one another.